Hi, everybody. Ben, you already gave me a good introduction. I don't really think I need to say anything else. But I do want to acknowledge some of the people in the room who are my colleagues. Sophia, the environmental director from Viejas, Lisa Kumper, who is the TIPO for the Hamul Indian Village. And I would run over and hug you, but you have to wait about 40 minutes. And then I'll come over and I'll give you a hug. You too, Sophia. And some of my wonderful staff, Kurt Brose and Keith Bowman, who work with me at the Paula Environmental Department. And a lot of other wonderful colleagues, and then a special shout out to Bonnie Bade from Cal State San Marcos, where I taught in her anthropology department for 14 years and made a lucky guess, and I decided to take a break from teaching at the end of the fall 2019 semester. Yeah, good timing for me, not so much for the pandemic, but I miss it, Bonnie. I will come back whenever you need me. But as Ben mentioned, you're not supposed to be seeing me today. You're supposed to be seeing our tribal chairman, Robert Smith. And chairman had to be out of town today and tomorrow, and so unfortunately he was unable to be here. But I got the email that said, with the text string, or the email string, and it just said, Shasta, which means that I was doing this, So he is a man of few but powerful words. But I am always honored to be representing Paula. I have worked there for 19 years, and it's been the honor of my life to be able to do this work for Paula and for many, many other tribes as well that I have made connections with, both in the California region and nationwide, both through the tribal historic preservation work I do and also through the climate change work that has become a very big part of my job. And the last thing I'll say is my own introduction is that I am not indigenous. I am a descendant of European settlers. But again, it's been such an honor for me to be in this position of responsibility and trust with Paula. And every day I wake up grateful that they haven't fired me yet. So one of the things I did in my master's work in anthropology was work on ethnobotany. And the people of the Paula Reservation, Paula was originally established as a Luiseno reservation. And in fact, the word Paula in Luiseno means water. It's right next to the San Luis Rey River. And in 1903, the Cupeño people were forcibly removed from their homeland, their village of Cupa in Warner Springs, and relocated to the Paula Reservation about 45 miles to the west from Cupa. And there are also some Kumeyaay villages in that region that were forcibly removed at that time. So there are actually people of Luiseno, Cupeño, and Kumeyaay descent all together on the Paula Reservation, all as one people, the Paula Band of Mission Indians. And the work that I did on my master's on ethnobotany was how I was able to meet the people of Paula and learn from them about native plants. And in case you haven't seen my arms, I am a fan of plants. And each of these plants has a story. Each of these plants is local to someplace important to me. I have a coast redwood tree for Humboldt State University. Go Lumberjacks! And I have a Rio Grande Cottonwood in honor of my time at University of New Mexico for my PhD. And then I have a bunch of other plants besides that come from right here in Southern California, except for this opium poppy. And I'll let you make up your own story about why I might have an opium poppy on my arm. But we are here to talk about plants, and we are here to talk about indigenous knowledge and sovereignty. And these are topics that are very near and dear to my heart because of the work that I do. So on this first slide, just my introductory slide, I have the name of white sage in Cupeño. It's Caxil. And Caxil white sage, what scientists know as Salvia apiana. You probably heard a little bit about it as we went through the garden today. You're going to probably hear more about it in other people's remarks today. But I want you to be aware that this is a plant that has so many traditional uses. And they're not just medicinal uses. This is a plant that's used for food. The seeds can be ground and made into mush. The dried leaves can be sprinkled on other food to give them a better flavor. I have this growing in my yard. I've thought about using it on my Thanksgiving turkey. I haven't done it yet, and I'm not sure why, but it's something that's edible, and it's usable, and it's medicinal, and it's ritual, and it's utilitarian. There are so many uses just to this one plant. And if you were on the same tour that Ben was leading, and by the way, you are a remarkably good tour leader. Thank you very much. I know it's embarrassing to be called out. How do I know? Ask me how I know, Ben. But we learn that indigenous knowledge is science. What indigenous people have done to learn the uses of these plants over millennia is science. It's indigenous knowledge. Well, it seems appropriate to talk about California's tribal nations with a background of the California state flower, the California poppy. But before we called it the California poppy, the Cupeño called it mejaxa. And guess what? This also has an ethnobotanical use. Not a whole lot that I was able to find in my research, but women, listen up. The pollen from the California poppy was used as a women's facial cosmetic. So something else worth trying. Yeah, I see that the ladies are like, oh, okay. Guys, it's not for you. Yeah, I'm sorry. You got to stay away from that. It was also used to provide a sedative to help calm babies. So this beautiful flower that you're more likely to see on the side of the highway with an influencer twirling in the middle of it, it actually has these important uses that Native people already understand. But I want to pause here because it says California's tribal nations. Let's talk a little bit about California's tribal nations. Ben mentioned that there are 18 tribal nations in San Diego County. I think that was when we were walking. And there are federally recognized nations, and there are some that are not federally recognized, which is a lecture for another time. But that is more than any other county in the entire United States. And there are 109 plus, I think there might be a few more now, federally recognized tribal nations in the state of California. That is more than anywhere else in the United States except Alaska. And yet most people don't think of California when they hear Native America. They think of Oklahoma, they think of the Dakotas, maybe they think of the Great Lakes regions, but they certainly don't think of California. Well, the culture here, the language, the people, so rich and so deep, and yet also so much trauma, so much loss from the legacy of colonialism and the mission system in California. And not just the mission system, which mostly impacted tribes on coastal California, but also inland, especially during the gold rush. There was so much loss and devastation. Anthropologists have estimated that the estimates range from 300,000 to over 1 million people, Native people in California before colonization. And by the time of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, there were only 30,000. That's a genocide. You can't call it anything else. Thankfully, it wasn't entirely successful, and we have seen a resurgence of people and places and culture and language in California, including in Paula, including in all of the tribes that I have worked with throughout the United States, tribes everywhere, federally recognized or not. So it's, I think, very important for you to understand who you are working with if you are working with indigenous people, so that you are aware that everywhere you go, no matter where you are on Native land. If you take nothing else away from what I am telling you today, remember that you are on Native land. So this idea that, well, we're on the Paula Reservation, this is Paula land, that's just part of the ancestral territory. The Kumeyaay to the south, the Luiseno to the north, the Cupeño and the Cahuilla to the east. Keep on going. Quetzan on the border, Chemehuevi near Nevada and Arizona on the Colorado River. The Karuk people, Hupa, all up in the northern parts of the state. You might think that there's no tribal land in the central part of the state because there aren't any federally recognized tribal nations or reservations, especially along the coast. That is Chumash land. That is Esalen land. That is Salinan land. And those are their colonizing names. They have their own names for themselves. So when you hear somebody, for example, give a land acknowledgement, let's just say that a lot of tribal folks have an uneasy relationship with the land acknowledgement because there's very little acknowledgement of that history that I just transmitted to you. The idea that we are fortunate to be able to build this facility or to have this institution on Kumeyaay land. We are on Kumeyaay land here in Encinitas, without also saying, and this is why we're able to do this, because of this legacy, because of this trauma, because of the losses of colonialism. The next part of that needs to be, this is what I plan to do. This is how I'm going to help make that better. I'm not just going to say I acknowledge that terrible things happened here and that the original stewards are no longer able to access this land without permission. I'm going to tell the whole story, and I'm going to talk about my part in making it better. So that is, thank you. So just keep that in mind. If you want to tune out for the rest of it, I don't recommend it, but at least remember that part. And I could talk a little bit about the sizes of the reservations and where they are, but I think it's just enough for you to know that you're on tribal land and that there are tribal nations throughout the nation and throughout the state. No, right? No. Okay. So let's move on to tribal sovereignty. This is what Chairman Smith had planned to talk about, and tribal sovereignty is a little bit of a slippery concept. But before I talk about tribal sovereignty, I just want to, again, talk about the plants. We are here for the plants. So Pashkevish, arroyo willow, and the favored species is Salix lasiolepis. So there are tons of uses for willow. For those of you who saw the quiche structure, it's quiche and cupeño. Lisa, what's the Kumeyaay name for a house, for a traditional house? A traditional house? In Kumeyaay? Awa? Oh, you're awa? Awa? Awa. It's awa. Thank you, Lisa. I actually was playing a little game of who's on first there for a second, so thank you for indulging me. It's awa. It's a quiche or a wamquiche in Cupeño, very similar word in Luiseño. So this is the plant that's used to make the outer walls of the quiche or the wamquiche. It's also, well, I think a lot of you probably know the medicinal use of willow, right? It's a painkiller. It's aspirin. It's salicylic acid. The Salix lasiolepis, or maybe it's lasiolepis. Does anybody want to fight me on that? I'll meet you outside when we're done. I love to. Oh, and by the way, Ari, thank you so much for saying symposia and not symposiums. You just made me fall in love with you a little bit. The fact that this has aspirin in it, this is something that was discovered through science, right? The species name and the genus name and also the family name, Salicaceae, that's where that comes from, is that salicylic acid or acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin. So some of the uses are not the way that you would normally take an aspirin, but you can take tea, you can take steam, you can chew the leaves, you can turn it into a poultice and bind it on a part of your body that's swollen or sore, and it'll help reduce that swelling, it'll help reduce that soreness. It's an anti-inflammatory. This is a plant that was mentioned in the creation story. That's how important it is. And yet for a lot of people, it's just something that grows in the rivers. It's something that has a lot of pollen that gets all over the place, when I'm trying to, clean my garden or my yard, or it gets on my pants when I'm hiking. But this is an incredibly important and sacred plant with both traditional and ritual and sacred uses. So it's part of the sacred landscape, part of the cultural heritage of the people of Paula and really throughout a lot of different places. So I want you to know that it's important, and I also want you to know and think about the fact that I told you that this particular species is the preferred species, which means that the people who use these plants know the difference. Willows aren't interchangeable. There's arroyo willow, there's Gooding's willow, there's other willows. This is the one that's preferred, which means that somebody or somebodies took the time and the effort to be able to distinguish between those species and which one was best for the uses that they had in mind. It also means, and you guys, this is the one that always blows my mind. Somebody saw a plant and was like, I wonder what'll happen if I eat that. And they ate it and they're all, dude, that headache totally went away. That's real science, but that's also brave. It's very brave. Ben made the joke that he stole from Kurt. I'm going to give Kurt credit for his joke. Every plant is edible at least once. So somebody decided to see if it was edible more than once or if it had any particular potency to it. And in doing that, they were doing native science. So what does that have to do with sovereignty? Well, nothing yet, except that it's the sovereignty to be able to make your own decisions. It's the sovereignty to be able to practice your traditional culture, to speak your language, to be able to practice your religion and your own ceremony, to use the plants in the way that you have learned to use them through time. from a federal and legal perspective, sovereignty simply means the right to make your own laws and be governed by them. That's what sovereignty means. It's a lot more complicated than that when it comes to the tribal-federal relationship, and again, that's a lecture for another time. But I do want to give at least a little bit of context to what sovereignty means in that federal sense, and it goes all the way back to the 1800s to a Supreme Court series of cases called the Marshall Trilogy. Chief Justice John Marshall essentially put into place the system that we know of today in terms of tribal sovereignty and that federal trust relationship. And I'm not going to repeat that language because it's very paternalistic, and it's unfortunate that it has managed to stay the way it has today, where the federal government essentially acts as a parent to the tribes in a way that the tribes don't necessarily need, and they certainly don't really want. But what Marshall said in one key case, Worcester v. Georgia, when it came to tribal sovereignty, was that Indian nations had always been considered as distinct, independent political communities, retaining their original natural rights as the undisputed possessors of the soil. The very term nation, so generally applied to them, means a people distinct from others. So that's the federal government's version of sovereignty. But for tribes, again, sovereignty means the right to practice your tradition, the right to have your culture, the right to make your own rules, make your own laws, and be governed by them. And I want you to keep that definition in mind as we talk about indigenous knowledge, which is the next slide. So this is Menet, also called datura. You might know it as Jimson weed or thornapple or tolowache. This is also, where is it? Here it is. Also on my arm. I had no idea what it was when I was a little girl and my dad pointed it out to me. All he said was, don't touch it. Don't touch it. If you don't know this already, it is intensely toxic, okay? So don't eat it, don't touch it. I'm very paranoid about it. If I even touch it, I'll wash my hands. I don't want to take any chances. But this is also an incredibly important sacred and medicinal plant. It has a lot of uses that I'm not going to go into here because it's not my place to talk about what those uses are. But I want you to know that this is not just a weed that grows in disturbed areas on the side of the road. This is an incredibly important plant with cultural uses. And that relates to indigenous knowledge. The indigenous knowledge that comes from the use and the understanding of this plant is part of indigenous sovereignty. So when we talk about indigenous knowledge, just like every tribal nation is distinct and has its own sovereignty, indigenous knowledge in the same way, every tribe has its own definition of indigenous knowledge. Some of you might hear it called TEK, or tribal ecological knowledge. When I talk to my colleagues, there's oftentimes a lot of debate about what kind of terms we should be using to talk about indigenous knowledge or indigenous scientific knowledge. And the reason we have those conversations is because when you separate that out, when you call indigenous knowledge something separate from, so-called Western or scientific knowledge, some people can see it as being less than because it's not part of their Western understanding of what science should be or what knowledge should be, but it's not. Nevertheless, indigenous knowledge, it is science, and it's something that tribes have sovereignty over. It's something that tribes control, or at least they should have the right, the sovereign right, to control that knowledge. We start to get into some really difficult issues here because we have no way to say we have a patentable Western legal right to this knowledge. And yet what we're trying to say with indigenous sovereignty and indigenous knowledge sovereignty is that tribes should and do have that right to control this knowledge. There is no requirement for tribes to share any of this knowledge. And as we get a little bit further along here, I'm going to talk about what some of the best practices are for being able to work with tribes on this knowledge. And I'll just give you a sneak preview and say, if a tribe says it's not for you, it's not for you. End of story. There's no arguing about that. That's the end of the story. So again, remembering that every tribe has its own definition is key, but of course there's going to be a lot of overlap. The federal government, under the Biden administration, has made some efforts to try to codify tribal knowledge and indigenous knowledge in policy statements and executive memoranda, not memorandums, just for you. Executive orders and that kind of thing about tribal consultation, about tribal sovereignty, and they have a new paper on indigenous knowledge that was done through the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. There were a lot of tribal folks on that advisory group, but there was not a representative from all 577 federally recognized tribes and the hundreds of non-federally recognized tribes and the indigenous Hawaiians and the indigenous Samoan peoples. All of those peoples, they weren't there. There were a few folks. They did as good a job as they could. And normally I don't like to just read from a slide. It's not up there because I want you to look at me, not at the slide. But this is what the indigenous knowledge definition is from OSTP at the White House. Indigenous knowledge is a body of observations, oral and written knowledge practices, and beliefs that promote environmental sustainability and the responsible stewardship of natural resources through relationships between humans and environmental systems. It is applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. Indigenous knowledge has evolved over millennia, continues to evolve, and includes insights based on evidence acquired through direct contact with the environment and long-term experiences, as well as extensive observations, lessons, and skills passed from generation to generation. If you want the slides that have that on it, I'm happy to share them from my notes, but you can also just look up Biden Indigenous Knowledge Policy and you will find OSTP, and you can see not only the policy itself, but a lot of the materials that came out associated with the Indigenous Knowledge Policy. I think that this is a reasonable definition, but it leaves so much out. So when I say that every tribe has their own definition, I think it's important to talk about what some of those definitions might include beyond what is written in a federal document. So indigenous knowledge is not just what we've learned through science and observation and experiment, or from reading or going to school. And it's not just what we can see and feel and touch. Indigenous knowledge is intangible. And it's not always explicable. It's not always explainable because it's intangible. And I'm looking at my friend Lisa because I think she understands this well. In our work as TIPOs, one of the most challenging things we come across is when somebody will say to us, there's no effect to a tribal cultural resource on this project, some sort of development project, because there's no archaeological sites. Right, Lisa? Oh, my friend Chris Devers is here. Hi, Chris. What's up? And what we say to that is, what do you mean? Just because there's not an archaeological site there doesn't mean that there's not significance to this land. Is there white sage? Is there willow? Is there an oak tree? Guess what? There's a tribal cultural resource on this land. Every single plant is a tribal cultural resource. Like I said before, this is all tribal land. There is no place that doesn't have some sort of tribal nexus, something that is tribally related. It is all there. Just because you can't see it or you don't know how to identify it doesn't mean it's not there. And the same is true for everything else that we may see or sense or know about the land. The plants, the animals, the sky, the air, the water, the people. Everything is a part of that tribal knowledge. And all of the things that tribes know about those intangible and tangible things is part of indigenous knowledge and comes under the umbrella of knowledge sovereignty that tribes have the right to control, or that they should have the right to control. I forgot to mention stories and experiences, ancestors. All of that is part of indigenous knowledge. And it needs to be protected as part of indigenous data sovereignty, which is our next slide. So here we have buckwheat, otherwise known as willicol in Cupeño, Eriogonum fasciculatum, which is one of my favorite scientific plant names to say. There's just something about fasciculatum that rolls off the tongue, mine anyway. This is another plant that has a lot of uses. You can eat it. You can use the leaves as a medicine. You can use it to give to babies for diarrhea. Fun fact. I don't know how to prepare it, and I'm not going to try. But again, this is one of those plants that people see and they're like, oh, that's just that weird plant. You know, it's pretty when it blooms like that, and then it just turns sort of brown and orange and, you know, dry and scabby, and it's not pretty. It's an incredibly important plant. It's part of traditional knowledge. So moving on from that idea, who controls that knowledge about Willicall? And that's part of what we're calling indigenous data sovereignty. So there's both data sovereignty and data governance. Data sovereignty is the concept that information, this is like the federal concept, information that has been converted and stored in binary digital form is subject to the laws of the country in which it is located. Wah, wah. That's not a very good definition. It doesn't cover tribal knowledge sovereignty at all. Only in binary format. What about a book? What about a story? You know, so there's got to be more to it than that. Data governance is a little bit more important. That is the ownership, collection, control, analysis, and use of the data. Now, I don't like calling tribal knowledge data. It's not data. It's knowledge. It's life. It's experience and culture. But if we can take some of these principles and modify them for our use, we can find some useful things to think about when it comes to those definitions and what we're talking about when we say indigenous knowledge sovereignty or indigenous data. So basically, any knowledge that an indigenous person or an indigenous community holds is indigenous data. Simple. Everything. That makes it very easy to remember. But we're talking about non-human relations with not just living things, but also with the earth itself, the mountains, the rocks, the water, the air. And then we're talking about data as individuals. What do people know as individuals? What are their experiences? Who are their relations? And then data about the tribes as collectives. What is your governance type? What is your history? All of those are part of indigenous data. So it's not just about the plants, it's about everything. And when we want to keep those knowledges, plural, when we want to keep those knowledges protected, there are ways to appropriately govern that knowledge when we're doing this kind of work. So again, it comes from sovereignty, that inherent right of the people to govern themselves, their lands, and their resources, and that includes their histories and cultures and traditions. It also includes where that knowledge comes from and how it is held in the community. So if you're a museum person or an archaeologist, you might call that provenance. Where did it come from and where has it been? Provenience and provenance. And is there a human rights framework within which we can position this? The UN DRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is one place to start, but you don't have to stop there. Work with the people themselves to find those ways that that data needs to be protected. And then finally, there's a collective benefit to the knowledge. It's not for the use of one person. It's certainly not for the use of one institution or one pharmaceutical company. And I'll tell you, that's kind of the reason I'm here, because I worry. I worry about where this knowledge is going to go, how it's going to be used, and how do they say it in Latin? Cui bono, who benefits? And if it's not the tribes, then I'm walking. Next slide, please. One of the frameworks that's been put in place for research is what's called the FAIR principles. This is an acronym. It stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But before I go a little bit further on that, let's talk about the plant we're looking at here. We saw it as we were touring. This is Yerba Santa, Eriodiction trichocalyx in this photo, but it's Sankat in Cupeño. And you can chew the fresh leaves to quench your thirst. Again, I don't know why I don't try these things. I'm just like, I'm not that risk-taking person who thought, I'm going to eat this and see what happens. Even when I know what's going to happen, I'm a little bit too anxious a person to try that. But it also has medicinal uses. And, again, in Ben's tour group, he told us that the Spanish called it Yerba Santa because he could see they could see all the indigenous people using it. They figured it must be sainted in some way. So there's the Santa, it's sacred. And that's not wrong, but not in the way that the Spanish probably thought. And again, this is another one of those plants that you just see on the side of the road, and most people are going to have no idea of its true significance. So under these FAIR guidelines, FAIR data, findable, basically, is it in a place that you know of? Do you know where it came from? Do you know where it is? Is it findable? Is it accessible? Is it being made available to other people for their use? And again, this is a little bit within our research framework. Interoperable, so can it be used in more than one place? For example, I don't know, have any of you ever gotten an email attachment and you open it and it's like a KMZ file and you go, what the heck is this? I don't know how to open this. KMZ is Google Earth, right? Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you, nerds. But maybe it comes as a Pages file and you don't have a Mac or something. So like, is it actually truly accessible? Is it interoperable? Can I open this and use it in the programs that I'm used to? And sometimes it's not. And so you end up having to download some sketchy app from the internet. And next thing you know, a Nigerian prince has all your money. So you have to be really careful. You don't want that to be the case. And then, of course, reusable. You need to be able to reuse the data. And that's important in science, replicability, right? We have a replicability crisis in the sciences right now, especially the social sciences. So those are the ones that were developed for basically Western research parameters. But if we go to the next slide, what we're adding to this is what we're calling the CARE principles. But before I get to CARE, let's talk about avahat, which is cottonwood. This is Populus fremontii, the Fremont cottonwood. Did you know that an edible mushroom grows in the high branches and trunk of the cottonwood tree? You do now. Who wants to climb up there and get some? Not me. But there is an edible mushroom that grows on the bark, and it has its own name. I didn't put that in my slide, and I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. Hey, and this is Final Jeopardy. Does anybody know what plant family cottonwood is in? Salicaceae. Yeah. Guess what? Same as willow. Guess what it has? Aspirin. Not as much, but it still has similar medicinal uses. Also, the wood is great for firewood. You can carve it out and you can make bowls out of the trunks. Lots of other uses. Again, I try not to talk too much about the medicinal uses or the sacred uses because those are not my knowledges to share. But again, beautiful tree with so much more to it than just having some, pretty green leaves. Here's mine. This is the Rio Grande cottonwood. I love being my own show and tell. So CARE, what does CARE stand for? And this is where it comes into the indigenous knowledge piece and the indigenous data sovereignty piece. The C is collective benefit. The A is authority to control. The R is responsibility. And the E is ethics. If you need a reminder of those, just look up CARE, FAIR principles. And there's a lot of information on the internet. I can also point you to a website at the Arizona State University that has an indigenous data sovereignty program, and there is a Kumeyaay citizen from Santa Isabel who works as part of that program, and he taught me a lot of what I am telling you now about CARE. Collective benefit, it seems like it's obvious, but I'm going to spell it out a little bit. That data ecosystems, these aren't my words, but they should function in a way that allows the indigenous people from whom that information came to benefit from that use. There must be a benefit to the people it came from. They're not giving you this knowledge for you to just take. This is knowledge that they collectively hold, and they are the ones who should benefit from it. And A, the authority to control, they need to be the authorities who control, right? Again, like I said in the beginning, if somebody says to you, I don't want you to know this, then your response is, okay, that's it. They control that knowledge. Even when the knowledge leaves their hands, there needs to be an authority to control that knowledge. And again, this is the place where I am really, really nervous about what's happening. When somebody synthesizes a molecule or they learn about a use of a plant and they figure out where exactly in the plant that came from, and then they can turn it into something, and then it's the next Ozempic and everybody gets rich except the indigenous people. Not okay. There is an authority to control. There is a responsibility to use this in an ethical, that's E, in an ethical way. Working with indigenous data means working with indigenous people. Working with indigenous data ethically and responsibly means holding that information and keeping it in the way that they want it to be kept and not sharing it with anybody without that authority, without that permission. Ethics overall means that the rights and the well-being of the indigenous peoples you work with should be the first thing in your mind. And that's a hard thing in this capitalist world system that we're a part of, right? If there's something to be made money from, then that's what people want to do. They want to make the money, but it's not just about the money. It shouldn't be just about the money. It should be about the community and the people and making sure that everybody has what they need and that you're not going to take this knowledge and say, cui bono, I benefit, and I'm going to take it from people who might need things, who might have things that have been taken from them. The example of white sage, the way white sage has been appropriated by, TikTokers and Etsy shops and that kind of thing. They are not using that sage in a way that it was meant to be used. And even making jokes. I remember seeing I think it was a political cartoon of somebody backing up a giant truck full of white sage to the White House after Trump left. We need to cleanse this space. And yeah, did I laugh? Yes, but at the same time, I cringed. I'm like, who are you to use this knowledge that doesn't belong to you to get rid of the stench of some white colonizer? No thanks. So things are being used and people think, well, I'm showing respect to the culture by using something that matters to you. You didn't ask for that. You didn't ask for permission, and it's not yours to do any more than I would go into a Catholic church and just decide to quench my thirst with the holy water. Well, actually, knowing me, I probably would. But I don't recommend you doing that. It's not a good idea. Okay, next slide. Let's talk a little bit about working with tribes, and then I'll be wrapping up here. This is one of my favorite trees of all time. This is black oak, Quercus kalagii. You guys, what do you think? Do I have a tattoo of this one? I do. This is called quinil in Cupeño. It is the most favored species of oak. There is a different Cupeño name for every species of oak in San Diego County and Riverside and, to what's east of us? Imperial County. But Quercus kalagii is the most favored because it has the biggest, tastiest, and most nutritious acorns, which, by the way, are poisonous. Yeah, this is where my mind gets blown. Like, who ate an acorn and it's bitter? It's full of tannic acid. Somebody ate an acorn and was like, patooey, that's disgusting. Let's figure out a way to eat it again. I wouldn't do that. I'd just go, ew, that's gross, and I don't eat it again. But somebody was like, but these are some big, healthy nuts, right? It would be a shame if we couldn't figure out a way to make this work. So over time and experimentation, folks figured out you grind it down into a powder, you leach it with water, and after every time you leach it, you taste. And if it's bitter still, then you leach it again until you get to the point where it tastes like absolutely nothing. Mr. Devers, what does Wewish taste like? He said it tastes like dirt, for those of you who couldn't hear it. So Wewish is the acorn mush. That's a Cupeño word for acorn mush. I'm not sure if it's the Luiseño word, too. Wewish? Okay. And somebody told me, I think it was Eric Ortega, told me a long time ago, he said, we called it Wewish because we wish we had something else to eat. And in Kumeyaay, I believe it's called shawi. Yeah. But yeah, it's tasteless. I've eaten it, and little kids have seen my face, and they're like, put some salt on it, put some beans in it, and then it tastes like beans. So then I like it. Yeah, Wewish is great, especially when there's beans in it. But it's a perfect food. It has protein. It has all sorts of nutrition. It's incredibly valuable as a food source. And a single black oak tree, and they only grow above a certain elevation, can have a crop of a ton of acorns in a single year. That's a lot of food. That's a reason why there's no agriculture the way that we normally think of agriculture in Southern California, because when you've got a crop that you can just shake out of a tree, why would you need to bother learning how to cultivate and grow foods in horticulture or agriculture? It's the reason why I tend to believe there was more than 1 million indigenous people in California pre-contact, because there was so much food. And then go up north and add salmon to the mix. Oh yeah, you've got a perfect meal. Put a little bit of that dried sage on it, and then your Wewish will taste like Thanksgiving. But if you're indigenous, you probably don't want to have your Wewish taste like Thanksgiving. There's lots of other uses to it as well, so an incredibly important species. And as far as working with tribes, that's the sort of thing you can learn. I learned that from working with a tribe, and I'm very grateful for the knowledge. But what I want to share with you is just a couple of bullet points of best practices for working with tribes. The first thing to do is you center the indigenous voice. Your voice is not the important voice. The indigenous voice the person you are working with, the community you are working with. You want to center that knowledge in your work. And if it doesn't feel right to you, if it kind of butts up against the way you've been taught, then just sit with that feeling of awkwardness, sit with that feeling of uncomfortableness until it doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore. And if you can't get away from that feeling of discomfort, then you need to just remove yourself from that scene because you're not the right person to be working with Indigenous knowledge. So center that Indigenous knowledge. And make sure that you acknowledge and understand the historical trauma that comes from being ancestors or descendants from ancestors who went through so much on your behalf for your survival. If we don't understand that, then we're not bringing our full knowledge and our full sympathy to the experience of the people that we're working with. Historical trauma has translated into the present. It's not just in the past, it's part of today. There's also an important need to recognize the systemic inequalities that have caused us to have not just Indigenous communities, but communities of color throughout the United States that are not receiving the resources that they need, that are still suffering from legacies of racism from centuries and even just a few decades past. That systemic inequality is still here, so that needs to be acknowledged as well. Don't let casinos fool you. I did my PhD dissertation on casinos, and I can tell you that the vast majority of tribes, fewer than half actually have gaming, and of the ones that do, only a tiny percentage at the top makes 90% of the money. So having a casino does not mean that somehow inequality, even economic inequality, is over. Respect sovereignty. Remember, tribes have the right to make their own laws, make their own rules, make their own cultural traditions be centered on the way that they live, and you don't have the right to take that away. Respecting sovereignty is key. And then finally, just remind yourself of who you are if you are not an Indigenous person. I have to do this all the time. You know, in the 19 years I've worked for Paula, and in the 22 years that I've worked in Paula, I have never not learned something on a pretty much daily basis for me as a non-Indigenous person. And I know there's a lot of things I am never going to learn because I am not an Indigenous person. So working with tribes does not just mean inviting them to sit at your table. It means also understanding when there is no right place at the table for you. That's the tribe's table. It's not yours. So don't go where you're not invited, but also don't leave an empty seat at your own table. You need to make sure that you bring in all the people that you need to do this work in the right way. And next slide, I believe, is my final slide. It is. Thank you very much.